I thought I'd start just by asking you both about the structure of two stories that you talk about at length, the Meek one in your case and at the Bay. We're always sort of told the shorthand, the quick version of what a short story is. You know, it's a reveal. There's a misdirection. You're told one story about a set of characters. You're given one account, and you're led to believe that version of events or that version of a characterization. And then there's a sudden sort of moment of revelation or a reveal or an epiphany, and suddenly you have to retrospectively kind of reevaluate everything. And that's it. Bish, bash, bosh, done. You've talked today about two stories which are very different in their structure. At the Bay seems to be a series of kind of rhythms, really, a series of small versions of those reveals. And again, with the Meek one, Jane, your story, that story sort of seems to have this series of different smaller epiphanies, and again shifts. And I wonder, kind of what do you think? Were the writers trying to escape the very simple one epiphany story? Were they trying to forge something different, or was it a kind of a novelistic ambition that underpinned those particular stories?
Well, in the case of Mansfield, I think yes, the two stories that form the sort of study in my essay, At the Bay and Daughters of the Late Colonel, are very differently structured. Generally, Mansfield was really interested in Chekhov's endings, which looked very radical on the page. And Virginia Woolf, when she first read Chekhov, was really quite taken aback by what she thought was, startlingly innovative. And she didn't really take to Chekhov at first, as many people didn't. But Mansfield absolutely felt the sort of impact of the endings of Chekhov stories, where suddenly life sort of just stops. And there's that sense that it is always in motion, always continuous, and therefore any neat tidying up of an ending is a false thing. So you can really feel that sort of ending, Chekhov's endings. But for me, because Mansfield is a different writer than Chekhov, in Chekhov there's a sense that meaning is deferred, or sometimes there's a kind of great loss. Well, it depends on the story. But in Mansfield, her provisionality is much more abundant. There's something much... She's more celebratory, I think, in her endings than Chekhov. Chekhov is just very non-judgmental and just very much holds the world. He observes it beautifully, the absurdity, the pathos, the tragedy, all of that. He gets it all in, but he stands quite back from it. Whereas at the end of a Mansfield story, very often, there is this perfect moment, this perfectly abundant moment that suggests a strange kind of life. Sometimes it's disturbing, as in the end of Miss Brill. There's a perfect image. You can almost feel sort of jigsaw puzzle, and it just clicking into place, the ending sentence of Miss Brill. Or in a story like A Doll's House, again, perfect image, and it just clicks into place and resonates outward with this strange, almost feeling of excess life. That's what Mansfield does that I find quite strange. There's almost a sense of a story not wanting to kind of, to have its cover closed. It's strangely alive, and we get that at the end of Mansfield. And that's her. That's her building on Chekhov, but making it quite different. Briefly, in terms of the two structures of those two stories, the Daughters of the Late Colonel, I'll just call it Daughters, I read you the bit where we get this, this terrific kind of unseating of everything we expected up to that point. But at the end, in spite of the comedy, we realize that Mansfield really loves these characters. She's not in any way laughing at them, as some of her reviewers thought. And she was deeply, deeply disheartened that people thought she was sneering at Jug and at Constantia. At the ending, as they sort of begin to sort of loosen the burden of father on them and to sort of lock him back in the wardrobe, we get these beautiful images. We just go zoom, plunge right into their interior worlds. And like like Woolf, Mansfield really recognised that there are contradictions in every moment, that every moment is not one thing or the other. Moments are imperfect, and feelings and impressions get mingled up. So one moment or one event in life is contradictory and messy. And at the end, we go into these beautiful glimpses when one sister imagines herself just stepping out into the open air, and the other sister imagines herself sort of bathed in light. Mansfield's better with those images than I am. But it's freedom, really. That's what we get to the end. We get this beautiful human glimpses of absolute freedom coming near the end of the story, and yet they don't feel neat. And my own feeling is that Mansfield came upon those moments, that they're not planned and plotted, that she simply was getting closer and closer to who her characters were, from external events going right into their essences. And Mansfield's beautiful, I think, at delivering the essences. It's almost as if the essence of something, as in poetry, just flares on the page. And we get those moments with each sister. At the Bay, the other story that Roll mentioned, is a gradual unveiling. It begins with a mist over a landscape of a bay in New Zealand that Mansfield knew well, and gradually in each little episode, with episode upon episode, there's a secret and there's a gradual mislifting, but it doesn't feel as neat as a reveal. Oops.
Sorry, that's all right. Yes, I kind of lost track of the question, right?
It was just a fascination with this kind of rhythmic form that the two writers were exploring in those two stories, and in some ways, the Meek one, it feels like a short story in that it's narrated immediately after the event in a kind of classic short story way, but there are other aspects that aren't very short story like.
No, indeed. And I think, when you talked about that there may be sort of reveals or epiphanies, in a way there aren't. Because, one of the things that's constantly being revealed is that he has to question what he's done and how he's understood it. And even when he thinks that he's finding new meanings in it, he's probably wrong. So one gets led deeper and deeper into he himself digs a deeper and deeper hole for himself, maybe. It is a story of exploration, but it doesn't end with any kind of conclusion at all. And when you originally asked the question, and while Alison was talking, I was trying to think of because the forms of his short stories really, really vary, and a number of them were written for very specific purposes. From 1873 onwards, he was conducting this wonderful experiment called a writer's diary, which was basically journalistic. But which contained short stories, and the short stories within it were often used to illustrate particular points. So there's a delightful little story called The Peasant Mary, or Mari, I don't know how you pronounce it, which you probably know, it's a very famous one. It's very, very short, and in that he talks about being in Siberia, in prison in Siberia, and hating the peasants, the drunken, idiotic, rough, foul, violent peasants around him, and then suddenly having a memory of being a child on his parents' estate and being frightened. He thinks he hears a wolf in the woods, and he runs out of the woods. He's very young, runs out of the woods, absolutely petrified, and he bumps into the peasant Mari, who's tilling the field, and the peasant is owned by his parent. The peasant is a chattel. The peasant comforts him and loves him, just says, what's the matter, and touches his lips. His finger's got earth, touches his lips and embraces him and makes the boy feel safe. And Dostoevsky uses that moment to illuminate that how can he feel hostility to the men around him? Because these men could be peasants like Mari. They could have that gentleness and that love inside them. They are not to be hated. They are human beings. But that story, which I first read on its own as a story which was an epiphany, and I thought, well, that's a classic short story form. When you read it in context, he's actually using it as an illustration for how, Russia can never be whole until the educated classes embrace the peasantry. And he tries to explain that in different ways, and then he decides that the best way to do it is to illustrate it by a story. So the setting of the story actually gives it a rather... it doesn't take away what the story is on its own, but it informs the story. And in fact, most of the stories that I've selected for this to talk about are in the writer's notebook. So, looking at the context will often give you more sense of, I suppose, the complicated things that he's doing. I've strayed away from your question because it doesn't quite fit what Dostoevsky was doing, I feel.
You're both, as well as writers, you both teach occasionally. You teach creative writing. And I wonder if I could ask you two sort of slightly separate questions. First, you, Alison. When teaching Catherine Mansfield, the central kind of skill of Mansfield's is this mesmerising, slightly absurd image, which sort of often sits right, centre stage in a story. And as a writer trying to learn from her, or as a creative writing teacher trying to tell students, what to learn and what to understand and appreciate, and maybe not emulate, but acquire in terms of their skills. How do you teach Mansfield, or how do you kind of get to the bottom of those images, because they're always utterly illogical?
Yeah, they're utterly illogical. And I have to confess, I haven't actually taught Mansfield. Yes, I haven't actually taught Mansfield, but I've taught many a short story writer. And trying to think about your question, gosh, that's where gift comes in. There's a certain level, I think, where you can really work with a student to train their skills of observation. You're always trying to get them to see more closely, to focus. I'm routinely putting that, as people would have put it in my stories early on, focus in the margins, focus. Can we see this more clearly? So I think it's out of two things with Mansfield. One, it's that deep, deep commitment to observation that she had, which for me runs deeper. Every short story writer has that, but for Mansfield it runs deeper. As I say, her lens is almost telephoto, and it gives quite a strange effect sometimes to even apparently ordinary description in a story. It all has this slightly weird quality while also vividly capturing a landscape, for example. So on the one hand, it's just the absolute dedication to observation. And I think when you commit, there's something weird that happens in the whole imaginative process. You're committed, you're really training yourself to see in some way. But the thing itself gives back to you in a way you can't quite account for. But I think writers who genuinely write and create big stories know that strange things come out of that deep commitment. And Mansfield spoke often about writing as an act of possession. Now, she goes back to that routine often in her diaries and notebooks. I have a tiny bit? I might have left it back at the hotel. She talks about. She says, I cannot. She says, when I observe a duck, I don't merely become the spectacle of the duck. I don't merely disappear into that scene. I become the duck. And she describes this in various scenarios. I become the bystander standing on the quay watching the ship go. She says until we truly become something, our writing doesn't take on. She calls it the bounding outline of real life. So there's something between this almost forensic observation of the world, and then something that is completely illogical, but that she's, I suppose, receptive to, where the imagination becomes this quite wild space, and she gives herself to that, and becomes entirely, entirely absorbed. And I think for anyone who does write a lot, you'll probably know that feeling of deep, or not just writing, it goes across life in many, many different forms, but deep absorption, new revelations and new insights come from that place. And she was very committed to that wild space of the mind, I suppose. Does that answer? Absolutely.
Jane, I was going to ask you about the fact, again, we talked about the Mig one and how it was very, it was one point of view, and we can only guess at what the wife was thinking through all these events and this story. What does that enable Dostoevsky, and what does that enable writers generally to, what are the benefits of just taking on one point of view, which is limited and maybe delusional, or maybe unreliable in the objective sense?
Well, the benefits for the writer obviously are that what you're doing immediately is creating a gap and inviting the reader in, because the reader inevitably will be thinking, well, what's the other person thinking? What's the other person in this relationship thinking? There's a marvellous story by Raymond Carver, which is called, I want to say it's called History, but I don't think it is called History. But I bet everyone here reads Raymond Carver, and you'll all know the one. It's the one where the man... he claims that his wife, someone purporting to be his wife, has put a letter under his study door. And he's very indignant because it's not her handwriting. And it turns out that his wife is leaving him. And he gives us this very jumbled account of their relationship. And it's perfectly obvious that her story is a totally, totally different one. And she does leave him at the end of the story. And what's amazing for the reader is that you piece it together, and gradually you start to sympathise with the wife, and gradually you start to understand that this man is a liar and is deluded, and you are forced to enter the story almost as the other voice, and that's what Dostoevsky's doing in The Meek One as well. So as a way of writing a story, it's very exciting, because you know that you are creating a space for the reader. And I think one of the things about short stories, which is perhaps even a cliche of short story, is that the short story, more than the novel, leaves a space for the reader, to imagine and to add and to bring themselves to the story. And that's what's very exciting about short story, I think, or one of the things that's very exciting about it.
Yeah, there's that wonderful sense of aftermath, isn't there? That kind of resonance afterwards.
Yeah.
When it's still, it has this kind of ongoing, uncanny life after that, where it completes itself in our minds, usually more so than a novel, probably.
Well, more so than a novel, because a novel is more finished.
Yes.
And a novel tells you everything you need to know about these people, and a short story leaves a space, and from the one day or the one action or the one moment in a life, like the stone goes into the pond, and your mind's doing the ripples, your mind is filling in the rest of the picture.
Great image. Any questions? I don't want to hog the debate here, so you've all been listening very, very quietly and patiently. Yeah.
I was very interested in the comment that short stories have a poetic quality. Is that something I've always felt as well? Is there more you could explore around that idea? What's poetic about, say, Mansfield's stories?
Yes, Mansfield, early on in her notebooks, she's writing lots of poetry, and those tend to be earlier efforts that you'll find scattered amongst the various papers of her notebooks. But she said, when I'm writing prose, I'm always trembling on the brink of poetry. So you're absolutely right, and I think that's a fair point for many short story writers, that the short story in its compression, in its sort of beautiful, its selection of detail, whether it's beautiful or ugly, is certainly much closer to poetry. But also, I'm really interested in this notion. Well, I love a distinction that George Surtees made, and he had an article in the Guardian about a year and a half ago, where he says that the real sort of power of poetry is in the way it creates essences on the page. So it goes right to the kind of inner life or inner essence, or the thinginess of something, the essence, and brings it alive onto the page. Whereas longer fiction, he argues, is more about situation, circumstance, and then testing characters under pressure. So it's more about building of situation and gradual revelation. But poetry does this essence thing. And for me, that short stories, and particularly Mansfield's short stories, that's why they're strange to me, is that they do bring in this power, I think, from poetic form, where in many Mansfield stories, the perfect image just, it sort of clicks into place. not in a mechanical way, but in an organic way. But with it, something just flares very strangely on the page. And for me, that's part of her. She was hugely well read in poets. Yeah, so absolutely, and for me as well, I think as a writer, I couldn't begin to quite divorce the two completely. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Because you brought Raymond Carver into the room, I thought I'd ask a question. It's related to Raymond Carver. It was about the role of the editor, Lillian. There's the issue about Raymond Carver's editor and the difference between the editors and the unedited stories. Yeah. And I didn't know, in your reading, you referred to Mansfield talking about, I'd rather do without the money than have the editor. I wondered if anything was known about the role of the editor in the production of stories of either writer.
Well, certainly when Dostoevsky was doing the Writer's Diary, which the Meek one appeared in, and The Dream of the Ridiculous Man, and Bobok, and a number of the other great stories, he was actually writing and publishing that himself. So he was not beholden to anybody. I'm not aware of him being particularly edited. But I have to say, I'm really not a Dostoevsky scholar. I'm just a reader, in the earlier work, it's possible. I'm not aware of it, though.
On Mansfield, she was, as she describes herself, such a stickler that by the time she then surrendered a story to an editor, you had the response, yes. Where is it? Yes. I've lost it. But I'd rather pluck out. Shall I pluck out the eyes of my story for 40 quid? And that those little sort of remonstrations appear in her notebooks fairly often. Just if she's had feedback from an editor, initially she's a little bit dubious, but and then it goes through. Sometimes she comes around, and sometimes she doesn't. But there's not detailed. I wouldn't know any detailed sort of editings of her stories to look at. Just these notes in her own notebooks, fairly mostly resentful, I suppose. But she always then makes herself look. She sort of seems to be slightly resentful at first, and then she goes back and seems to have to weigh it up.
Actually, if I can add one thing that I do know about Dostoevsky, when he was working on the writer's notebook, which sets out to be terribly chatty and like a speaking voice, just very everyday. Actually, and I haven't seen these, but apparently it's possible to see notebooks where he actually shows how he himself edited his work to make it seem completely informal and completely chatty. So he was an extremely strict. I mean, and again, it's this this notion that certainly I have had in the past of Dostoevsky as this great sprawling genius who just lets it all happen. Actually, no. Of course, he's a craftsman. He edits himself tightly, particularly, specifically. He makes it precise because he cares about language and he cares about what he's saying.
There was another question here.
Yeah, I've enjoyed reading stories by both of you two, and I like short stories to be kind of short. And I got a bit of a shock when I went and did the homework and looked at some Dostoevsky and Mansfield. They are, some of them, quite long. The question is really, now after the short story, how short is short? Does it matter?
I think you've answered your... Yes, I think doesn't matter is the good question. I think... oh, goodness. And Jane is a far more experienced novelist than I am, so if we're trying to think between the forms, I suppose, for me as a writer, one of the most important qualities is a kind of intensity. That's what I want from a short story. And so, for me, that's never stretched, or rarely stretched beyond about 8,000 words. Mansfield stories, you're right, do, at the Bay... Gosh, I'll have to go back and look. I believe it's 60 pages. Prelude is also very long. Je ne parle pas français is about 40. So she does have these long stories that unfold, some of which in straight episodes, or in sort of almost discrete episodes, rather than building up through a unity of scenes. But I think... she's trying to do different things in different stories. So in a very long story, like At the Bay, she really is trying to create this sense of all of life contained within, I think it's one day, I should know that, but I'd have to think back. One day at the summer colony near Wellington. So it's just one day of this family holiday. And the notion of sort of creating this whole world is out of things is really what she's trying to do in that story. So I understand why she's stretched to many episodes, but it's still contained. It still feels very much like a whole. I'm not. I think the thing is having. It's the sense of compression still that we're getting in that world. Everything distilled down, and it's not. We don't have plot and subplot. I think that's a very crude answer, but novels often have plot and subplot stitched together. So circumstances multiply, whereas Mansfield does, even in her longer stories, keep the focus, the frame tight. It's quite contained, even over 60 pages. It's a woolly answer, I'm afraid, but it's a tricky question. It's a good question, though.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question, and I think, with Dostoevsky, his stories range from, a page and a half to, all the way up to novel length. I mean, you've got a number of very, very long short stories, which, I would say, Notes from the Underground and The Eternal Husband are novellas, basically. It seems to me that he wrote to the length that it needed to be. And the ones which are more like parables or fables or, the fantastical ones are very tightly, a very tight, short length and deliver the punch or the punchline that they need to deliver. But once you get into more psychological exploration, he gives himself the space to let it grow and grow. And I think, it's interesting. It seems to me that there are short story writers who do need a longer length as well. Thinking of contemporary writers, William Trevor, one of absolutely the greats. He will write some short stories which are really very short, and he will write, novella length. It's almost like, the material will, if you like, find its length. I guess the material will find its fitting length, or the writer will find the fitting length of the material. There isn't an ideal answer, though. It's occasionally very riling when you get these short story competitions, and it's 3,000 words, 5,000 words, 8,000 words, and it's very prescriptive. Yeah. And sometimes a story needs to be, bigger, different.
Yeah. And of course, Alice Munro's stories again. Yeah. Someone else who has seemingly on the page quite large, many pages, sprawling stories almost. And she describes, in terms of short story structure, she describes the act of writing as going into a house. And she says, I really could start in any room in that house. Which is interesting because I couldn't. There's a place where I have to begin. And I can't sprawl. I need that compression for the intensity, I suppose, I want to give in many stories anyway.
There's a few people I need to thank. Firstly, Manchester Literature Festival and Wilcar and the International Anthony Burgess Foundation for hosting this event. I obviously need to thank the Arts Council as well, which supports everything Comma does and enables us to promote and discuss and champion and celebrate the short story. And as I say, this is part of an ongoing project. The anthology of essays, collection of essays, Morphologies will be published at the sort of mid-November. So do keep an eye on our website. If you'd like to sign up to our mailing list, there's a mailing list sheet at the back. But I guess it just remains for me now to ask you to join me in thanking two fantastic speakers for tonight's amazing event. Jane Rogers.